So it is now my pleasure to introduce our next panel as we're doing a staging shift. Thank you so much. So our next panel is going to be about the changing role of funders, and I'm really excited to invite the next group up. And again, I'm not going to read all their bios, but they should be able to give you a better understanding of where their organizations have been in looking at trends and where they're headed, again, to kind of set the stage. I will introduce the moderator, Elizabeth Jale, who's the Director and Associate Professor for the Nonprofit Leadership at Seattle University. She has a particular expertise in this topic, so we're very honored to have Elizabeth moderate this conversation, and you'll see the titles for the other speakers, and you'll get to know them when they speak. Thank you. Go ahead, Elizabeth.
Thanks so much, Kristen, and what a pleasure to be with you all this morning. I'm so happy to be moderating our conversation this morning about the changing role of funders in philanthropy and ways to really think about transforming the funding relationships. So many of you in the audience might be aware of movements to democratize philanthropy or funding, either through forms of participatory grant making or trust-based philanthropy, to move dollars and decision-making closer to the communities that are most impacted. We've also seen renewed calls, and Rob and Akhtar's conversation touched on this, for the importance of conveners, intermediaries, and collaborative funds, who really serve as connectors for donors and recipients. And I'll just share one little piece of recent news. Last week, the Center for Effective Philanthropy reported that concerns around how nonprofits could handle the large unrestricted gifts of Mackenzie Scott were quite unfounded, and that instead these gifts brought organizations more financial stability and the ability to expand programs and pursue new opportunities. Only 2% of the nonprofits that they had surveyed encountered any major challenge related to handling the unrestricted donation, and 80% said they had no challenges at all. Panorama Global, who's also here at the conference today, also found that a lack of trust has defined funding to organizations in the Global South, and that the Scott gifts have really helped leverage or given these organizations the leverage to prove their capacity and expertise. So I'm joined here by three fabulous women in the global philanthropy space. You each bring an interesting and different perspective to this conversation as funders, conveners, and grantors. So let's just start by hearing about, when it comes to the question of funding, what are one or two trends that you've been seeing within your own organization? And I'll start with Rufaro.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, and thank you to Global Washington for this opportunity to come and share about how we work. We're very passionate about that at the Global Fund for Women. So two trends that I'm seeing is the role of technology has become important and critical to how we do our work. For example, research shows that when movements are identified in their formulating stages and their emerging stages, identifying them quickly as funders and supporting them helps strengthen and achieve success. So we are starting to use technology to identify movements when they're emerging, and we're using what we call our Gender Justice Data Hub, and that helps us sift through conversations that are happening on social media to learn where our movements will be emerging. And then the second trend I'm seeing is at the Global Fund for Women, I was a grantee partner in Zimbabwe, and I already felt that the Global Fund for Women was a century ahead of their time. But we're always challenged with our founding story, with how Anne Firth Marie just saw the need for trust-based philanthropy in the 80s. And so we always challenge ourselves that we also need to go a century ahead of time. And so what I'm seeing now is we've really evolved and advancing our transformative philanthropy practices. Before, you would have someone like myself working in the San Francisco Bay Area, managing the reproductive or crisis portfolio, making decisions about who gets money and how much. But now we've shifted that, and all the decision making is being done by movements. We are giving them millions, and we say we trust you, lead, and we follow. We've become more of followers. That's the new trend.
Thank you. How about you, Alicia?
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. It's great to be with all of you today. I'll kind of answer it through the lens of corporate philanthropy. And one of the things that's really unique about corporate philanthropy is that we get to tap into the wonderful resources of our parent company and their superpowers to really accelerate our philanthropic investments. And you think about Starbucks, you think about great coffee, hopefully, but you also should think about the 450,000 employees that we have worldwide. We call them Starbucks partners. We have store operations in 38,000. We have 38,000 stores in about 82, 83 markets around the world, and millions of customers coming in and out of our doors. The reason I share that is that we leverage that size and that scale both through our corporation as well as the foundation to contribute positively to those communities. And the way in which that we do that is symbiotic. One of the ways that, if you think about Starbucks, we are really committed to securing the future of coffee for all. And we think about that through the lens of holistic farmer support, really focused on agricultural practices, outcomes related to yield and productivity. Where the Starbucks Foundation comes in is we really support in those same coffee communities, but we focus on uplifting women and girls, recognizing that when you lift up a woman, you're lifting up her entire ecosystem and you're really helping the livelihoods of that community. That would not be possible if we just had the Starbucks Corporation making investments in coffee communities, because so many other things would rise to the top. The reason I share that example is one of the things we're seeing in corporate philanthropy is that the ways in which companies are giving back, it continues to increase, but the ways in which they do that is actually diversifying. And so what I mean by that is the spectrum of all of the ways corporations are doing good is expanding from just exclusively corporate philanthropy doing good for doing good's purposes in community, but we're also doing a lot more around corporate sponsorships and commercial initiatives that do good, but also have brand, reputation related kind of outcomes. Then you have kind of our core business investments that are strengthening our core business, but that are having indirect outcomes on people and planet. And then that last piece is around like how we're starting to use our balance sheet investments for good. And so think about kind of for Starbucks, we have a global farmer fund that is a rotating fund that comes out of Treasury. And so that spectrum is getting much more defined. And so you're not just, especially for nonprofits, you're no longer just working with those of us in corporate philanthropy, but you're also actually engaging with some folks on the enterprise sustainability team or treasury teams. And so that landscape within our enterprises is definitely expanding. And then really quickly on our superpowers, right? Like a second trend for us is thinking about how we're engaging our employees in the giving process and really thinking about how do we engage them in who we are funding and how are we enabling them through those grants and that funding to be able to further engage in their communities. And so an example of that is before 2020, all of our US giving for the Starbucks Foundation was decided by 1 or 2 employees on the foundation team and a handful of representatives from retail across North America. Now for context, a handful does not represent the 250,000 employees we have across North America, but we made some great grants in a very few amount of cities and very limited awareness, limited employee engagement. And so I was in Baltimore back in 2019, and it was a town right outside of Baltimore. I had this amazing conversation with the store manager, and they were telling me all about how they're engaging with their local community and their nonprofit and what that looks like and how the community comes together. And I was like, this is amazing. You know, I work for the Starbucks Foundation, here is what we do. And this partner just said, that's great, but you'll never fund us. We're not important enough. And it was such a great moment because it was such a defining moment of like, what are we gonna do about that? Like, how do we change that on its head? And we now run a program called Neighborhood Grants. So most of our US giving, like 95% of our US giving is actually our Neighborhood Grants program. And last year we engaged in 2 rounds. So we opened a round where you as an employee, any employee from the US or Canada, can nominate a nonprofit in your community for a grant from the Starbucks Foundation. Last year alone, we had 40,000 nominations. We gave $5 million in grants to over 1,000 nonprofits around the country. And it's really democratized this process of who we are listening to help inform our funding. And it's done 3 things for us. One, it is enabling us to fund grassroots organizations that would have never been on our radar. A lot of these organizations are volunteer run, have budgets under $1 million. The second thing that it's enabled is it's strengthening the local relationships in those communities. And so the grant funding is nice for those organizations, but it's actually not the thing that they get the most value out of. It's that relationship with their local store, their local barista. Now they have all of these volunteers and this ecosystem. And then the third is because our brand shares the same siren as Starbucks, the Starbucks Foundation actually gives them a lot of validity in their community and actually is helping them fundraise. So thank you for the question, Elizabeth.
Thank you. So Suzanne, a few trends that you're seeing?
Yeah, there's a couple. First of all, it's so lovely to be here, and what a great strategic space. It already feels like that. Doctor, thank you for kicking off the morning so powerfully. First of all, I'll put a +1 on Rufaro, something that you mentioned, and you were talking about the use of technology as a trend, and I would say also the use of data in our fundraising operation is something that I would highlight for this particular group, like how much we are using enhanced data science and data analytic tools to better understand our donor role and to meet their needs where they are as philanthropists and as givers and stakeholders and supporters. So just a +1 on that. And then Alicia, on you, a +1 on this employee engagement question. Like what an incredible, if you think of corporates and you think of corporate philanthropy and you forget the tens of thousands of people who work for those places and how they want to be value aligned with their charitable giving, and they also want to be aligned really with the overall, sort of gist and spirit of the company. I think that's something that we've seen. I call it stickiness. Like we're never working with any one company in any one way. And once you get to the employee engagement, it's like, it's the gold of any business because that's the people who like make the work happen and then make the giving happen. So just to sort of emphasize both of those themes that you raised. I think specific for USA for UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, I'd lift up maybe 1 or 2. One is this sort of like ever-changing nexus between disaster and emergency funding and development funding. And I call it a trend because donors and supporters are coming to us kind of every day with different sets of expectations of how they want to engage. I mean, so many donors are moved by disaster and moved by emergency relief, and it's our job to help those supporters then stay with us over time. Number one, because a lot of emergencies don't resolve themselves in a short period of time. They become protracted crises, particularly when you're thinking of those who've been forcibly displaced and people who become refugees may have that status, technically speaking, for years. So how do we then sort of this nexus of development and emergency and disaster relief? I like to say that all donors are disaster relief donors because if you're really focused on sort of human-centered change and the rights and dignity of humans around the world, then you have to be also committed to when those same human beings find themselves in a moment of strife, of crisis, of persecution, of conflict, and of violence. So that's the first, is just kind of always trying to stay on the top of that conversation and meet the intellectual and strategic needs of our supporters that we're there with them. I think this one's a much more tactical answer, but I love fundraising, always have. It's sort of why I stay in the kind of CEO space in the nonprofit world, is that the trend that I'm seeing of groups really diversifying the kind of funding that they raise. And you've heard this for 20 years, right? Oh, you got to diversify your funding base. But for a long time, people, number one, didn't really take it seriously, and number two, didn't really know how to do it. And I'm finding more and more engaged curiosity about how do you really diversify your funding base? Like, if you've only ever been foundation funded, what does it it mean to start a major gifts program? If you're looking at corporate philanthropy from the outside, but you want to get in there and play, who do you talk to about building that kind of program? I see that at my organization. It's the first place I've been with such an incredibly diverse array of revenue channels, which means then that we are hearing from so many different people why they care about this issue. And my mom, who is a supporter, monthly sustainer, is giving for very faith-based reasons, right? She's giving because she's a devout Catholic and she cares for the suffering of humanity. That's a different reason, perhaps, than our partners like Airbnb or like Starbucks are giving, and is also a different reason than a partner like Global Fund for Women would be engaged with us in the delivery of programs in a refugee camp in Ethiopia, let's say. So I just think that sort of the more we focus on diversifying revenue, you then are diversifying your partners, you're diversifying your stakeholders, and so then you're diversifying the input that you get about how you shape and develop your programs. So that's a trend that I'm seeing, and I think there's just sort of more leadership kind of like energy that I can put toward that at my own organization and in the community at large.
Thank you. So we're going to get a little bit more specific to each of your organizations. So I'll start with Rufaro. The Global Fund for Women uses what you call a feminist approach to funding movements. And we want to know more about this approach and how is it unique?
Thank you so much for that question. So we view, for me as someone from the African culture, our feminist approach to philanthropy embodies a lot of what you see in the culture. We see ourselves as a sisterhood. And when I say ourselves, our grantee partners, and even our resource partners, whether they're from North America or they're from Kampala or Bangladesh. So that's how, so first we understand that we are sisters and we are connected and we are a big family that feels passionate about gender justice. So the second way, the other way is infrastructure. So with that context, listening is very important. We don't have programs that predetermine what we're going to do or how we're going to fund. We frequently conduct listening tours, whether it's with our resource partners or our partners in country. In addition to that, the way we also do feminist philanthropy is evolving. In the past, we said we're in it for the long haul, and we felt 3 years was, this is 10 years ago probably is what the thinking was. And now we've come to a place where we say a minimum of 10 years. So we are making commitments to the movements that we support for a minimum of 10 years. In addition to that, thank you very much. So in addition to that, we also, we, as I say, we are followers, so we ask the organizations what it is they want support, even when it comes to how you monitor, which is something I had to unlearn other practices I've learned in learning evaluation and analytics. We actually don't have a predetermined evaluation framework. We actually ask our partners, what is it? What does success look like to you? And when they inform us, then we create the technical infrastructure that's required that will help them collect the information they need and to help them articulate, the results and the learnings. It's so there's so many components to that, but I started with the philosophies, with the values that are on this slide, which is listening, being in it for the long haul. And when I mentioned the issue about evaluation, more than money, this relationship is more than money, as what Suzanne mentioned, technical support. We as Global Fund for Women feel that we are successful when our partners exceed us in funding. And we're seeing it so close with the African Women's Development Fund, which Global Fund for Women seeded, and now we are at par with them.
Wow.
So to do that, we have invest in technical support, having our partners understand what is the technology we are using for our donor relations management, what are some skills that we're using in communications, and even what are self-care practices that can help sustain, the women who are leading this effort. And so what we fund is women-led. So that's the main criteria. We've had some pretend to be men in the past. Some men pretend to be women, and we were able to find them because we have an expertise of 2,500, a network of 2,500 advisors that are both regional experts and also subject matter experts. So when we are in any negotiations with any group, they're like the CIA or FBI. They go and they tell you, I saw this in action when I was a grantee partner, and I just got curious to say, what did they say about my organization in Zimbabwe? And I saw a long report. And I was like, how did they know all of this? So they are people. So we trust people in the regions that they are expert, they know the work, they know the mechanisms. And then now we're centering more on movements. Before, the way we worked was like an individual tree. We know that if you water a tree, it will go green. It might form a little shade in its area. But now we're moving to centering more on movements, where instead of focusing on individual organizations, we're centering on movements, because we believe that's like nurturing a forest. When forests are nurtured, they have global impact on the well-beings of everyone in this world. So we are centering more on movements, and how we are supporting these movements is when they identified, we look to recommendations, how we identify them. There are recommendations made, and also there's technology. So once we've identified good opportunities, we fund a landscape study that regional experts will conduct. We then hire in-country experts. We're now one of those offices, those organizations that are 100% remote, what you were mentioning. So it's definitely one of our trends where our staff and the members who are doing the work in-country are becoming more than us, our US-based offices. And then since we're supporting movements, there are some movements that have been around the same time as the Global Fund for Women, where they have governing structures, and some don't. So when they don't have those governing structures, we help them formulate a movement advisory committee. And that committee's role is to determine how it is they want to support, what organizations they want to support in their movement, how much they want to give. So we process the grants on our end. So if you're looking at this PowerPoint slide, in purple is what Global Fund for Women does, and in green is what our movements partners do. And to wrap it up, you've all been patient. I'm quite a chatter. So we process grants, and then we also have multi-year. As we mentioned, now the minimum criteria is 10 years. We tell movements we're in it for 10 years, and we publish. We've become more of learners. We're learning a lot, and we publish learning, and we advocate as well.
Fabulous. So I'll turn to Suzanne. For USA for UNHCR, how does cash assistance help in fostering positive outcomes for refugees, particularly in terms of enhancing their empowerment and resilience during the process of rebuilding their lives in a new place?
It's a great question, and I'll step back and sort of help you understand why this topic was chosen, because UNHCR works in all sorts of sectors and areas, on water and sanitation, on health, on education. So why would we pick cash-based assistance, which, by the way, is not complicated. It's giving cash to people to buy what they need to buy, pay for rent, pay for school, buy food, etc. So I had just started my job, and I was in Thailand meeting with the other directors of the 9 national associations for UNHCR. Japan, Australia, Spain, and many of my colleagues said, I don't know why in the US, but this cash-based assistance work that UNHCR does really works well. My donors don't like it. They don't like to, sort of put just kind of free money in the hands of. So I thought, well, I gotta figure out why. What is it about this program that really speaks to American donors, which, by the way, it does, and I'm so proud of it, that USA for UNHCR can be such a generous contributor to UNHCR's programming. And I think that there's a couple of reasons. One is that giving cash gives dignity of choice. So this is a variation on this trust-based theme. This is at a really micro level. It's not a lot of money, but it really is putting cash into the hands of families who are literally looking to pay for rent and to send their kids to school. 85% of forcibly displaced persons don't live in camps. Only 15% live in camps. So 85% are in urban environments where they have to pay for stuff. And so you not only are giving dignity of choice, but you're also infusing a local economy. Now, granted, there's many places where refugees are living that don't have vibrant and thriving local economies. So that's sort of part of the challenge. But where those economies are looking for an infusion, you're giving extra cash into the space. And I just love the sort of notion of autonomy to families who in that moment have been stripped of so much decision-making power, autonomy, agency, et cetera, and how small gifts, we're talking $140 to a family, can pay for rent and allow them to not go into debt while they're paying for their kids' school fees. So, and that local community piece, let me just say that when you are infusing cash into a local economy, you are helping sort of feed the balance between host communities and displaced communities, and that's really important. That's important here in the US, it's important around the world. Welcoming communities have a carrying capacity, we've found, and that all the tools that we can put on the table that help really lengthen the carrying capacity of that welcoming energy so that communities really stay in it for long-term integration, long-term inclusion, long-term, because remember, these crises are protracted. People are not coming in for 4 or 6 months. Sometimes it's many years. And so I think using the tools at our disposal to really kind of bolster the capacity of those communities and families is really important. This photo is a beautiful photo. This is the daughter of Ahmed and Futaim. They are Syrian refugees living in Jordan. And they had been there they'd been there for many years, but they had been on a 2-year waiting list to get into some of UNHCR's programming, including some of these livelihoods and cash-based assistance. Meanwhile, they were not going to give up the dream of their children going to school. Mary Maker, I'm thinking of you and looking at you. They would not give up their children's education. They finally got off the waiting list and began then to be recipients of a very small sort of infusion of cash on a monthly basis. It went right not just to sort of supporting rent, but also supporting education, not allowing them to go into debt. And we were able to take one of USA for UNHCR's donors to Jordan to witness this firsthand. This person had been giving, sort of an individual gift, went back to their community, corralled all of their friends and neighbors to make sort of a collective gift into this cash-based assistance programming for families like this family in Jordan, Syrian refugees. There's one more slide, a beautiful photo of Angelina. This is actually in a camp in South Sudan. So again, Mary, I'm thinking of you and holding your spirit here on the stage this morning. Her cash-based assistance, because she's an internally displaced person, so she's no longer living in the town where she came from because of conflict, but she is in a camp run by UNHCR and started a business. And she started a restaurant, and she's feeding between 30 and 40 customers a day. And the sense of purpose and the sense of kind of connection to a livelihood that she is able to gain from this cash small entrepreneur, small business grant is really extraordinary. And so that's another way in which cash-based assistance can help small enterprises where allowed. And remember, we're always sort of working closely with with host country governments to ensure that these kinds of programs are allowed. And when they are, they have incredible impact for individuals, for families and communities. Angelina talks about, like, number one, I'm running a restaurant, so I've always got food for my family. She's employing 3 other people in the IDP center. She's a little bit famous because she's making beautiful food that people are reminded of from their, their hometowns and villages. So that's sort of one slice of programming. We do so much of it, but that cash-based assistance it's so easy and sort of straightforward, and I love the kind of beautiful stories that it helps tell when it's executed well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So Alicia, the StarX Foundation gives direct grants, but you also partner with others in co-investments. So I know you touched upon this in your opening remarks, but can you tell us more about this and how you work with business partners and suppliers and even peer companies to help leverage your support?
Yeah, I'm happy to. Maybe I'll start with an example of how this comes to life. Some of you may remember in May earlier this year, there were significant floods and landslides in Rwanda that caused over 130 people to lose their lives. More than 5,000 families lost their homes, and it had a very significant impact in coffee communities in Rwanda. A few days after the floods, we got in touch with our agronomists and farmer support center in Rwanda, who reached out and was in touch with a lot of our suppliers and smallholder farmers in Rwanda and recognized just the significant impact on their livelihoods, their homes, their farms, and just their futures. And at the same time, we also were in communication with Ripple Effect, who's one of our nonprofit partners. We've worked with them since 2018 in Rwanda and other locations, and they were starting a needs assessment to understand, beyond the emergency support that was happening from the government, what would be some of the medium-term needs the community would have, and where and how could they support. And so through the Starbucks Foundation, we immediately gave a grant to Ripple Effect to support their needs on the ground. They were able to deploy additional housing, food distribution, and start to really build plans and infrastructure for thinking through like that medium-term support, specifically in the southern province, which is where we had thought the majority of coffee communities have been impacted. We went back and worked with our Farmers Support Center and the agronomist team. They shared kind of out what Ripple Effect was doing with our suppliers in the market. And they came back to us and said one of the suppliers, Sukafina, has actually identified very similar needs in an unmet area in the Western province, and they will match the Starbucks Foundation's gift to Ripple Effect if Ripple Effect can also expand into the Western province. And so that might seem like a very small way of partnering with a supplier, the farmer support centers, our agronomist teams, but it kind of shows like the ecosystem in which that we are trying to do all of our giving, whether that is a large-scale multi-million-dollar investment with a long-time nonprofit partner, or it is in context of current disasters or things that are happening in the moment. One of the things that I love about this example is that that three-way conversation is now leading to many other conversations and longer-term opportunities for what we will be able to do together in a three-way partnership between Sukafina, who's a supplier, the Starbucks Foundation, and Ripple Effect in the future, recognizing there's so much opportunity in Rwanda to lift up women and girls, even beyond the communities that were impacted by the floods. So that's kind of a very specific example for how that comes to life, but again, goes back to those superpowers and that flywheel that we have through all of the assets from the Starbucks Corporation that we can leverage in our philanthropy. A similar example, but larger in scale and somewhat magnitude, is we operate stores, as I mentioned, in 83 countries around the world. In most of those countries, we don't operate those stores ourselves. We work together with a business partner who operates that market, and they really run the stores. The employees in the store are their employees. Some of those business partners are extraordinarily advanced. Think about Tata in India or Alsea in Mexico, who runs a number of markets for us throughout the world. They are large, they have their own foundations and their own infrastructures. And some are really small and on their starting journey for how they are working in this particular industry. The reason I share that is a couple of years ago, in 2022, we, through the foundation, said we want to do more giving in a structured way in the countries in which we have a store presence. And so very similar to the example with neighborhood grants that I shared earlier, is we started a nomination process and invited all of our business partners to nominate nonprofits in their markets, and said to them, you tell us who are the nonprofits aligned to our values, aligned to kind of our areas of focus, who are doing great work in your community. However, when you nominate, and here is kind of how much we can give in each market and what that all looks like and the framework that it have to adhere to, we would want you to have skin in the game. And so therefore, if we give a grant to that nonprofit, here is a spectrum of expectations, recognizing not every partner is going to be able to do all of those things, but from light touch, make sure we have volunteers from Starbucks who are volunteering with that nonprofit, to maybe there's opportunities in your market to raise awareness for that nonprofit or that cause through your stores. Maybe there's opportunities for you to co-invest with us. Like, we'd love for it to be one-to-one co-investment, or you invest 75% and we will invest the rest. And so that kind of spectrum of engagement has really then helped us to drive engagement, because not everyone's ready for one-on-one matching if they're a small business partner, whereas like Alsea idea from day one was like, we'll match you 1-to-1 and do all these other things that you'd like us to do. And so that's been a really effective model for us to partner over the last 2 years. So we've about, as I mentioned, like 82 markets, 83 markets across the globe. We now have over 60 that are partnering with us in these international grants. We have over 120 grants that we've given in the last 2 years, about $7 million. So, for us, again, our size and scale of our corporate foundation is relatively small, but it's a big program. But last year, we went from a one for every dollar we invested, or for every $5 we invested in the first year, $1 was matched. Last year, for every $3 we invested, $1 was matched. So we are on a trend where we're starting to see that these business partners also want to do more, and it is a journey we're trying to bring them along on.
Thank you. And I think one of the themes that I kind of hear in each of your examples is really tapping into communities, whether it's the communities of movements, the host communities of refugees, and the communities of your business partners. So we're gonna do a little future thinking to wrap up today. I want each of you to kind of share, what do you think the future of funding will look like in 5 or 10 years, particularly in the global development space? Where do you think these trends are going to take us? Maybe you can start with Suzanne and we'll work our way back.
Okay, that's good because I don't have to follow my brilliant colleagues and try to sound smart. I mean, there's a couple of things, and some of this is, sort of issue specific, but I mean, I think there's going to be a real continued evolution of what the most effective leadership looks like and what's needed. And I mean that at the global levels, at organizations and foundations, all the way down to the most local levels. I think we're watching this real inflection point of leadership and effective engagement. So I think that will continue to evolve. I think that we also will continue to evolve in our understanding of impact and the story of impact. I know there's sort of how many different swirls of impact in every different sort of circle of philanthropy. And I'm not sure if we'll ever settle on one story of the most effective way of telling that, but I do think that we will begin to engage in maybe more rational discourse across the different kind of impact models, and so that we really do understand that everything from movement building to the delivery of vaccines and back again have their place in a space. I see that as something that maybe will evolve more over the next 5 to 10 years. Risk-taking, thinking about Rob this morning, and sort of what does it mean to really be supported by your donors to do the big audacious stuff, even though it might not work, and then be given the continued support to learn from what didn't work and sort of try again. I think there's some circles of philanthropy that are really sophisticated at that, and I would love to see those circles sort of spread and have the ripple effect to tell more circles of philanthropy how much more fun it is to kind of get in there. And then the last trend I'd say, and this is, I started my career in the mid-90s and was getting support at that point from Hewlett and Packard, who were one of the sort of one of the first and the only who were giving general operating support. And fast forward to today in this conversation around trust-based philanthropy and unrestricted funding, the truth is that the less restricted your funding is, the more you really get to know an organization in its entirety. The more you get to know the leadership, the more you get to know what keeps me up at night. If your support is really in a lane that's very projectized and restricted, you'll get to know everything about that lane, and that's powerful. But I do think that we will begin to really understand the richness that kind of partnership can bring. I love to tell donors what keeps me up at night. I love to talk about the programs that don't work, but that relationship has to already be sort of centered on a space of real foundation that I know you want me to succeed because we're in this enterprise of ending human suffering together. So those are a couple of crystal balls, and I think Akhtar and I are going to start a podcast, and we'll do a couple of those episodes together.
You've been recruited. Yeah. I'll pick up on we're in it together theme and context. I think one of the things that kind of ties to cash assistance and the movements that you're funding is, I think we might see a shift from funding large-scale institutions to identifying ways in which to channel more funds directly into change makers and grassroots hyper-local organizations in the global south. Like Yeah.
Good.
And I think that that's going to be incredibly powerful because those are the individuals who are most proximate to those we're trying to reach. An example for me of an organization that comes top of mind, who's at the forefront of doing some of this work, is some of you might be familiar with them, the United Nations Women's Peace and Humanitarian Fund. You might be thinking, a UN agency, really? But they are an extraordinary, really, exactly. They are an extraordinary organization that if you don't know them, please Google them and think about ways in which you can get engaged, because what they do is they galvanize a movement of global funding, and they directly invest that in women and their organizations. And they are women who are peace builders, they are women who prevent conflict, and they are really strengthening their communities at the hyper-local level. And what the Women's Peace and Humanitarian Fund has identified, and what we so appreciate of them as a funder of theirs, is that they are doing all of the due diligence to ensure that the funds get to those women directly. And they're not just getting them the funds, but they're also providing capacity building and training, and they're connecting women to one another, either in their countries or creating a broader network. So that creates such value. It removes so much of the intermediaries in that process, and sometimes you need those intermediaries, so don't misinterpret that. But I think it just gets you such direct access to individuals. And one of the powerful stats is that they have moved from, in 2016, they started with funding 10 projects. Now they've funded over 1,000 projects in over 40 countries. And they're really empowering and uplifting the role of women in their case as those change makers in their community. So I'm really passionate about that. And I think thinking about like what are the other mechanisms in the future that will enable us to do that. Like we, as an example, through the Starbucks Foundation, work with them, and we know exactly the women that we fund in the DRC, and they're incredible women in coffee. Same thing in Colombia, where there's still so much, some pockets, a lot of conflict and a lot of peace building that needs to happen. And so it's just a really powerful movement. And then the second, I won't repeat any of the great things you said, Suzanne, but the second thing that is on my mind is around we are going to need to continue to be extraordinarily creative. Because the reality is that everyone's budget is constrained, and our problems are growing exponentially by the day. And so if we think about the rising number of individuals who are displaced, if we think about the climate crisis, and so where and how can we be creative as companies? Like our funding is not gonna increase triple digits every year, and so where are our assets that we can pull into? What does radical collaboration look like amongst funders? How do we make it easier for nonprofits? We have a lot of work ahead of us.
Thank you. And Rufaro, we just have a couple minutes.
Okay, so I'll try and do this in 1 minute. So just +1 on peace and security. I flew in from Denver, where we have one of our individual donors who's part of that network. And so I was just thinking about my response when you raised the question is, we want to see more funding for women and peace and security. Listening to her, she was so passionate. She believes that if women are in decision-making, have decision-making power in peace-building process, they will have more impact. She strongly believes that there'll be more peace in this world if women are in the center of peace-building and conflict and investing in those efforts. And secondly, as a person with roots in Zimbabwe, I was impacted by a local philanthropist who is working very closely with the Gates Foundation, the Higher Life Foundation. They didn't know who I was, but when they heard about the work that I was doing, one of the employees just asked me to list all the young girls we're working with in our community. And some of them were living with HIV. And I just thought, most donors want long-term, they want to see the numbers. But they would fund us to support young girls living with HIV and AIDS, even though they had less than a few years to live. So I hope to see more of that. And what even helped mitigate the COVID pandemic in Africa is when two of them joined forces, the Dangote Foundation and the Higher Life Foundation. So seeing more of that. And then we also have an individual giving program, which we call 1.9 Rising. We see it as a movement where to increase the amount of giving for gender justice. We receive 1.9, and if you now look at efforts led by women of color, it's even lower than that. There is very limited or scarce funding for women of color-led initiatives globally and in the United States of America. And then also, I've been in, lastly, in global philanthropy for 2 decades. And I have not seen many conversations around race. There's just an assumption made that because we do good work, so we are good people. And so I see us challenging even donors to really examine who they are giving money to ask organizations, do you have an anti-racism strategy? What's your anti-racism strategy? And to just be cognizant on the Black experience, the fact is the darkest person in any nation, even if it's within Africa itself, even if it's within India, is usually the most discriminated person. So I'm hoping there's more sensitivity and more commitment by philanthropy to racial equality in the workplace.
Well, I just want to thank all of you. I think you've given us a lot to think about. You've given us some high points, some work for the future. Please give our panelists one last round of applause. Thank you for joining me